What's up, movie fans? Guys, you can probably notice that my set looks very, very different right now compared to what it usually looks like. I just got done rearranging my entire room, including my set, which is in my bedroom. Yeah, it looks completely different now. But yeah, this is how things are going to be from now on. Anyway, getting into the topic of today's video. So at this point in my channel's history, you guys have probably realized that I normally prioritize reviewing basically every piece of Marvel content that comes out in a year, which is why I imagine some people who actually watch my channel regularly were probably surprised when earlier this year I was completely silent on a very, very popular piece of Marvel content that came out earlier this year, and that content is X-Men 97, a brand new animated Disney Plus show that came out earlier this year. And I did not watch this series when it first came out for one simple reason. I had never watched X-Men the animated series, the show that X-Men 97 is a direct sequel to. I had heard people saying that you could watch X-Men 97 without watching X-Men the animated series, but I still wanted to watch X-Men the animated series, and the reason why is actually pretty interesting. You see, when I was a much younger child, I was obviously always into superheroes. I was a huge fan of the Avengers, Spider-Man, the Justice League, and I would watch any animated show that I could find, any movie that came out. I was obsessed with superheroes. But the one superhero team that I never really got into were the X-Men, which is why I only just watched the Fox movies for the first time around 2 years ago. For some reason, I just never got into the X-Men as a kid, so I never watched any animated shows. So I kind of wanted to watch X-Men the animated series for the first time because I kind of saw this as my chance to finally experience who the X-Men really are. Because let's face it, from what I understand, the Fox movies aren't the most comic accurate piece of media. Over the course of the past few months, I watched X-Men the animated series for the first time, and then I watched X-Men 97. And I want to spend most of this video talking about X-Men 97 because I have a lot to say about it. But I also just want to quickly talk about my thoughts on X-Men the animated series. It's really good. It's a really good animated show. Obviously, it's from the 90s, so there are some elements with it that haven't aged the best. Obviously, the animation doesn't look that great by today's standards. There's some elements that are kind of corny, kind of cheesy, but this show was actually a lot more mature than a lot of other Saturday morning cartoons, and I was kind of surprised about that. And the show also finally really got me into the X-Men. Like, let's face it, once again, the Fox movies are kind of just about Wolverine, Professor X, and Magneto. They never really focus that deeply into other characters. And after watching this show, I finally understand who these other characters are. I understand why people like Cyclops, why people like Storm, why people like Rogue. Like, all of those characters were super cool in this show. I loved them. My favorite main characters in the show were definitely Beast and Gambit. I loved those two in the show so much, but even though those are my favorite main characters, they're not my favorite characters overall because that award has to go to Nightcrawler. He's literally only in 2 episodes of X-Men the Animated Series, yet he immediately solidifies himself as the coolest and most interesting character in the show. I absolutely loved him. This show finally showed me a good version of the Dark Phoenix saga, which was pretty cool. In general, I thought that the main storylines of every single season, except for maybe season 5, were pretty interesting. This show introduced me to Mr. Sinister for the first time, and I thought he was awesome. I finally understand why Apocalypse is actually a good villain. Like, yeah, this was just a fantastic animated series, in my opinion, and I understand why so many people have nostalgia for it. I really enjoyed the show. So with all of that being said, what are my thoughts on X-Men 97, the direct sequel to this show that came out 20-something years later? So with X-Men 97, instead of doing my normal everything I liked, everything I disliked, and then my final score, I actually kind of want to go episode by episode with this show because I think that my thoughts as the show progressed make this review a little bit more interesting. So I watched the first episode of the show, To Me, My X-Men, and immediately the first 2 things that I noticed when I started the show were, 1, I thought that this show was just a phenomenal tribute to the animated series. I obviously don't have nostalgia for the animated series because I literally only just watched it, but even I thought that it was so cool how they just straight up reanimated the intro of the show. And then the show also just continues right where the animated series left off perfectly. The story feels like a perfectly natural progression, and I really, really liked that. And just like the animated series, this show treats every single character with respect. As soon as the show started and you have like the opening sequence where Cyclops starts like beating the crap out of all of these Friends of Humanity people, I thought that that was just awesome. It was a cool way to start the show, and it immediately showed me, okay, this show is actually respecting Cyclops, just like the original series and unlike the Fox movies. The other thing that I noticed right off the bat when I started the show was that the animation is beautiful. Seriously, this is some of the best 2D animation that I have ever seen. Every single frame of this show looked incredible, and that's something that I'm not really going to mention that much throughout the video, but just know that that is something that applies to the entire show. Yeah, overall, I thought that the first episode of this series was pretty good. I didn't necessarily think that it was anything to go crazy over, but I kind of just thought, okay, this is a nice continuation to the original show. It kind of gave me that feeling of a Saturday morning cartoon that's willing to get a little bit more mature. That's what I was thinking after I watched the first episode of the show. And, just a spoiler for later in the video, my thoughts on it quickly changed to something completely different, which we will get to. Anyway, episode 2 I thought was a lot more interesting than episode 1. Episode 2, Mutant Liberation Begins, centers around the team finding out that in Professor X's will, he actually left control of the X-Men in the hands of Magneto. And so that creates a really interesting conflict in this second episode, as you have the X-Men basically trying to learn how to trust their worst adversary. And I thought that that was incredibly interesting. And I thought that Magneto, I'm just gonna spoil this right now, was the most interesting character in this entire show. I'll dive deeper into that later, but in this first episode that he appears in, he's super interesting because even though he fundamentally disagrees with Charles's viewpoint on human-mutant coexistence, he still goes along with it because Charles was obviously his best friend and he wants to respect his legacy. And I thought that that was really interesting and perfectly in line with Magneto's character from the original animated series. So right from the start, I thought that Magneto was just super interesting in this show, and he also has the best dialogue in the entire show. Once again, that's not really something I'm going to mention that much throughout the video, but that applies to every episode. Episode 2 also has a pretty fun subplot with Jean going into labor and Wolverine being the only one there to help her, which is just a comedic gold concept. And then the episode also starts off Storm's character arc for the season as she loses her powers in this episode, which I thought was a really interesting plot development. Then we get into episode 3, Fire Made Flesh. And this is the first episode of the show where I kind of realized, okay, my initial thoughts about this kind of being a more mature Saturday morning cartoon were completely off, because episode 3 showed me that this show was willing to get dark. Episode 3 is essentially a horror episode where Mr. Sinister returns and he starts giving the X-Men these frightening visions of their worst fears, and it's genuinely really creepy. Once again, fantastic animation in this show, and the animation team managed to make these visions look as disturbing as possible, and I thought that that was fantastic. But the other element of this episode that was really, really interesting and frankly really, really bold was the plot twist related to Jean. In this episode, you learn that the version of Jean that you have been seeing in this show so far isn't the real Jean. She's a clone created by Mr. Sinister. But then the twist goes a step further and reveals not only was Jean in this show a clone, she was also a clone throughout most of X-Men the Animated Series, or at least she probably was. They don't really give us a clear answer. They leave it kind of up to your own interpretation when Jean was actually switched out with the clone, because neither Jean or the clone, who later renames herself Madeline, can remember when they were switched out. And that is such an interesting story beat that adds to so much natural drama between Jean and Madeline, as well as also leading to natural drama between the two of them and Scott, because Scott doesn't know whether he married the real Jean or Madeline, and that's just such an interesting story development. The episode ends on such a sad note as you have Scott and Jean, or rather Scott and Madeline, forced to send their son to the future because he is infected with Mr. Sinister's virus, and they don't know if they can find a cure in their timeline. And that is just such a sad ending. And this is where I kind of have to confess something. I already knew before I watched this show, I think I already knew before I watched the Fox movies, that Cable was related to Cyclops and Jean Grey. So as soon as they sent their son to the future, I immediately thought, oh, okay, I know where this is going. This is gonna come back later, isn't it? So yeah, that wasn't really surprising to me. I just wanted to quickly specify that before I went further into the video. Anyway, yeah, episode 3 was incredibly interesting, and it quickly showed me that this show was willing to go much darker than I thought it would. And then episode 4, I'm not gonna lie, it's kind of the weakest episode of the show. Episode 4, Motendo / Life Death Part 1, is kind of focused on two subplots. One featuring Jubilee and Sunspot getting trapped in a video game, and the other featuring Storm and Forge trying to find a way to get Storm's powers back. I thought that the second subplot was way more interesting than the first one. However, I still didn't think it had the same urgency as the first 3 episodes of the show. And then the first subplot, it was fun enough. I liked seeing Mojo again, but it just wasn't as interesting as the rest of the show. I don't really have a lot to say about episode 4. It's a fine, solid enough episode, but it is easily the weakest one of the show. And now we get into episode 5, Remember It, which in direct contrast is one of the best episodes of this entire show. Heck, it probably is in like my top 3 or top 2 episodes of the entire show, because this episode is just insane. Basically, the first half of this episode starts relatively peaceful, as you have this episode centering around Genosha, the mutant nation, getting accepted into the United Nations, which is a super cool development in mutant-human coexistence. And so you have Magneto, Rogue, and Gambit going to Genosha to celebrate this occasion. And while they're there, they meet a ton of different mutants from the original animated series, which was super cool, including the GOAT, Nightcrawler. Nightcrawler is in this episode. I was so happy when I saw him. I already kind of knew from things that I had heard that he was going to be in this show, but I didn't know when he was going to show up. And I also didn't know that after this point in the show, he would just straight up become a main character. So that was kind of cool. I did not expect that, but I could not be happier. I love Nightcrawler so much. But anyway, yeah, the first half of this episode is kind of peaceful, but there's some drama that's going on as well, as Scott and Jean are having relationship troubles due to everything that has happened with Madeline, and now them having to send their baby to the future. And there's some other relationship problems going on. Okay, I'm gonna have to address this. So, full disclosure, my literal only problem with X-Men 97. I'm not kidding about this. I do not have a single other problem with the show. This is literally my only one. The Rogue, Magneto, and Gambit love triangle is so dumb. What were they thinking with this plot line? Magneto and Rogue being together before the events of the animated series? What? Magneto was in his 60s before the events of the animated series. Rogue was a teenager. Why would you have that plotline? That is so weird. Rogue and Gambit's relationship was perfect. There was no reason to touch it. I understand that Magneto isn't the best guy, but you basically made him a groomer, which I don't think is in character for him at all. Just, I did not like that plotline. It led to some compelling drama between Rogue and Gambit, but I just really hated the fact that they went in that direction with Magneto and Rogue. So yeah, that is my biggest and kind of only problem with the show. Yeah, so this episode centers pretty heavily on that entire dynamic that's going on, but mostly the episode is kind of just this peaceful celebration of Genosha getting accepted into the United Nations, and it's pretty fun and peaceful and cool, and then suddenly a giant three-headed sentinel shows up and starts massacring all of the citizens of the country. And I just sat there in shock. Like I said earlier, I did not expect the series to get as dark as it did in episode 3. In episode 5, it went insanely dark, as they literally show you mutants getting completely massacred, and me, as well as the characters in the show, are just in complete shock. Nobody knows how to process it. And the episode ends in the saddest way possible, with Gambit, one of my favorite characters from the original series, sacrificing himself to destroy the Sentinel. And it was absolutely heartbreaking, especially Rogue's reaction to Gambit's death. Like, her holding him with her own skin, she's finally able to touch him, but it's because he died. That's so sad. Like, he went out in the coolest way possible, but his death was just absolutely devastating. But yeah, episode 5, like, I truly did not expect it to go into the direction that it did, and it just completely shocked me when I watched it. And after I finished it, I was genuinely thinking, where do you even go from here? Like, I have no idea where the rest of this season is going. Anyway, then we get episode 6, Life Death Part 2. And I'm gonna be real here, this is a pretty good episode, but it suffers from the fact that it is placed at the absolute worst time in the season, because obviously after watching episode 5, you want to see how the X-Men and the world reacts to the Genosha massacre, and instead you have to wait through this episode, which is just 2 subplots. Once again, one half is the conclusion to the Life-Death storyline, with Rogue continuing to try to get her powers back, and the other plotline reveals that Professor X is still alive and he has now become the Emperor of the Shi'ar alien race, which was kind of set up at the end of the original animated series. And I liked both of these plot lines. Once again, the life-death plotline was way more interesting. The scene where Rogue gets her powers back genuinely might be one of my favorite scenes in the entire show. The visuals, the voice acting, the music, like all of it just came together to make it one of the best scenes in the whole show. Super well executed, super satisfying after watching through all of these episodes of Rogue trying to get her powers back. But yeah, in general, even though I liked both of these plot lines, I also did like the Professor X plotline. I thought that both of them were kind of placed at an inconvenient time. That's really all I have to say about this episode. Episode 7, Bright Eyes, was way more interesting, as in that episode you have the direct follow-up to the Genosha Massacre, and it's a super well done episode, as the X-Men basically have absolutely no idea what to do, how to react to this. They're all just kind of in shock. And in particular, one of my favorite scenes in the entire show is actually the scene where Beast kind of goes off on the one reporter over it, because Beast is normally so calm and composed. So seeing him genuinely angry about what happened was super well done, a great scene. I liked the plot line where you have Sunspot revealing that he is a mutant to his mom, and you have that plot line simultaneously being satisfying because the mom accepts her son. She accepts the fact that he is a mutant, but it's also got a catch because she wants him to keep it a secret. She's okay with him being a mutant as long as none of her friends find out about it. And I thought that that was a super well-written scene. I thought that, like, Jubilee and Sunspot's reaction to that was super well-written. That was just a great subplot. And then, obviously, the most interesting plot line in this episode was Rogue's reaction to Gambit's death, where she straight up kind of has a villain arc in this episode, where she tracks down and gets revenge on everyone involved in the Genosha Massacre, and I thought that that was a super interesting plotline. And she is eventually pulled out of her revenge-fueled rampage by none other than Nightcrawler, the GOAT! Yeah, I'm so happy that he appears as a main character in the second half of this show. I was so happy. It was such a pleasant surprise. Oh yeah, this episode also features a Captain America cameo, which was pretty cool. And the episode ends with revealing who the main villain of the show actually is, and it is the character who I had never heard of prior to watching this show, Bastion. But luckily, I didn't have to look up who Bastion was or anything, because Episode 8, Tolerance is Extinction, Part 1, explained it perfectly. This episode is basically all about explaining who Bastion is as a character, and I thought that Bastion was an absolutely fantastic villain. He had a super interesting and complex backstory, but he was also just a really threatening, pure evil villain. And I mean that. He is pure evil. Doctor Doom gets a little cameo in this episode, and you find out that he's kind of in league with Bastion. And I thought that it was a fantastic way of showing how evil Bastion is, because even Doom is a little bit caught off guard by how insane Bastion's complete disregard for mutant life was during the Genosha massacre, and I thought that that was a really good way of showing how evil he is. This episode also has a nice little subplot with Scott and Jean reuniting with Cable and the three of them getting to spend time together. And the episode also ends with a super awesome action sequence where you get Wolverine and the GOAT, Nightcrawler, just fighting all of these human Sentinel hybrids, and it's a super awesome sequence. The episode ends with Magneto breaking free of his imprisonment at the hands of Bastion, and Professor X returning to Earth, which brings us to Episode 9, Tolerance is Extinction, Part 2. The best episode of the show. And the reason why it is my favorite episode of the show is because this episode finally made me realize what the show's ultimate endgame was. This show is the first piece of X-Men media I have ever seen that actually made me think for a second that maybe Magneto was right. Every piece of X-Men media that I have ever seen has always had such a Charles Xavier bias. He's the good guy. Magneto's the bad guy. End of discussion. Magneto, while he's a tragic villain, he's still a villain. He still needs to be stopped. But in this show, Magneto tried it Xavier's way. He tried mutant-human coexistence, and what happened? The humans rejected it, and they destroyed Genosha. So, in this episode, Magneto is fed up. He is tired of giving humans chances. He's tired of listening to Xavier. And the whole time I was watching the episode, I was just thinking, I can't blame him. Like, for the first time, I felt like Magneto had a point. And that is just so interesting. And so that is why this is my favorite episode of the show, because this episode focuses heavily on Xavier's conflict with Magneto, and I think that this is probably the most interesting that moral conflict has ever gotten to me. Anyway, this episode also just has a ton of really cool action. My favorite part of the episode was the fight between Jean and Sinister. I thought that was a super satisfying kind of conclusion to Jean's arc, where Sinister actually offers to tell her when he switched her and Madeline if she stands down. And Jean basically just accepts that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, and she beats the crap out of Sinister. I thought that was a fantastic plot line. And then the episode ends in a super shocking way where Wolverine stabs Magneto, and for a second I thought, holy crap, is this show about to kill off Magneto? And then Magneto retaliates by pulling all of the adamantium out of Wolverine's skeleton, which just left me with my jaw dropped, because once again, I didn't realize that this show was willing to get that brutal. And that brings us to the finale of X-Men 97, Tolerance is Extinction, Part 3. It's a great finale. It's not necessarily one of my favorite episodes of the show. Like, it would definitely be top 5. Like, it's in the top half. But in general, I thought that this was just a fantastic, satisfying conclusion to the show, where you have the X-Men having an amazing final showdown with Bastion. It has a ton of cool action. One of my favorite moments in the entire season, once again, is when Jean pulls all of the mutant DNA out of Mr. Sinister, and we see how old Mr. Sinister actually is. And then Morph, who I have somehow not mentioned at all in this entire video, Morph gets to kind of have a moment of revenge against Mr. Sinister for all of the things that Mr. Sinister did to Morph in the original animated series, and I thought that that was a great kind of conclusion to Morph's arc. I also liked the plot line where Xavier is kind of trying to help Magneto remember who he is by going through Magneto's memories, and I thought that that was a great subplot. And then the final fight against Bastion, once again, was just awesome. One thing that I want to note about it is that I thought it was really, really cool that Jubilee managed to get a critical hit in on Bastion in the final battle, because in the original show, Jubilee was always the rookie, the newbie, and so when you get to that moment, it was kind of satisfying because Jubilee's a part of the team now. She beat up the bad guy, and I thought that that was super cool. And then the episode ends on a cliffhanger, setting up season 2 as the X-Men get lost in time, and you have the tease at the very end of Apocalypse. So, yeah, I wanted to just talk about this entire series, kind of recap the whole thing, and get all of my thoughts on it out there, because I loved X-Men 97. Like, I promise you, I probably wouldn't have actually made a video on it if I just thought the series was good, and I probably would not have made the video this long. But when I finished it, I just had such an urge to talk about everything in this show, because it is genuinely one of the best superhero shows that I have ever seen. It's easily one of the best Marvel shows that Disney Plus has done. I am going to give X-Men 97 a 10 out of 10 for now. I will note, once again, my issues with the Rogue Magneto subplot are extremely bad. Like, I hated that subplot, and only time will tell if that subplot is enough for me to bump the show down to a 9 out of 10. But for right now, I seriously did absolutely love this show. So yeah, if you somehow haven't watched X-Men 97, I just spoiled the whole thing to you. But still, watch it. It's a pretty good show. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like and subscribe. Comment down below, what are your thoughts on X-Men 97, and see ya, movie fans.